tell you about a bowl. It was chipped on one side, a kind of dull yellow underneath all that flour dust, and it sat on the counter of my mother's kitchen for as long as I can remember. Not in a cupboard, not tucked away, right there on the counter, covered with a damp cloth, day in and day out, for years. I didn't understand what it was for until I was old enough to be trusted near the stove myself. That bowl was how our family ate bread when there wasn't money for much of anything else. I think about that bowl more than almost anything else from my childhood kitchen. My mother grew up in hard times, real hard times, the kind where a nickel meant something and a sack of flour had to last a family of 7 for weeks on end. She learned to bake bread from her own mother, who learned it from hers, and by the time it reached me, it wasn't really a recipe anymore. It was closer to a way of surviving that happened to taste wonderful. Here's the thing that always gets me. Most bread advice you find nowadays treats yeast like it's the whole story. Use more yeast, the recipes say, so it rises faster. Buy the good kind, the expensive kind, use a whole packet for a single loaf. And I understand why they say that. It works, and it's quick, and quick sells, but my mother didn't have money for a whole packet of yeast every time she wanted bread on the table, and she had 6 children to feed, not 1 loaf's worth of hunger, but 6 loaves worth, week after week. So she did something different. She figured out how to make a tiny bit of yeast go further than anybody today would believe possible. And the bread that came out of that chipped yellow bowl was some of the best I've ever had in my whole life, before or since. By the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through her exact method, step by step, the same way she showed me on a stool pulled up to that counter when I was maybe 8 years old. You'll learn how to stretch a small spoonful of yeast into enough leavening for a full, hearty loaf, using nothing but flour, water, salt, a little patience, and one small trick that most people have simply never been taught because nobody around anymore to teach it. It isn't a fancy method. It isn't going to give you some picture-perfect bakery loaf with a shiny crust, but it is honest bread, made the way it was made when there wasn't a choice to make it any other way, and I think there's something in that worth holding on to. I'm Rosalie Jean, and I have been baking bread in my own kitchen for over 50 years now. I didn't go to any culinary school. I don't have a certificate on my wall. What I have is a mother who taught me with her hands, standing right next to me, correcting the way I folded the dough with a gentle tap and a "no dear" like this. That's where all of what I know comes from, and it's why I still do things the old way more often than not. Now, before we get into the how of it, I do want to give you one more little piece of this. Near the end, I'm going to tell you about the crock my mother kept that chipped yellow bowl's dough starter in, and why she never once, in all the years I watched her bake, threw away the last bit of that day's dough. It's a small thing, but it might be my favorite part of this whole story, and I think you'll want to hear it. Let's get into the why of it first, because once you understand why this trick works, you'll never look at a yeast packet the same way again. Here is the one thing you need to understand, and it's simpler than you'd think. Yeast is alive. It's a living thing, a tiny organism, and like any living thing, it doesn't just do a job once and stop. It eats, it grows, and it multiplies. Given enough time, warmth, and a little food in the form of flour and sugar, a small amount of yeast will turn into a much larger amount of yeast, all on its own, without you adding a single bit more to the jar. Most modern recipes solve the problem of, "I want bread today," by throwing in more yeast so the dough puffs up fast. That's a shortcut bought with money. My mother didn't have the money, so she used the other thing she did have, which was time. She'd start her dough the night before, sometimes even 2 nights before, using barely a pinch of yeast, and she'd let those little organisms do what they do naturally, multiply, slowly, overnight, while she slept. Here's the line I want you to remember, the one you could repeat to a friend if she ever asks you why her bread never turns out right. Yeast is patient work, not expensive work. If you don't have money to spend on it, you spend time instead, and the bread doesn't know the difference. That's the whole secret sitting right there. It's not a trick so much as a swap. Time for money. And in my mother's day, time was the one thing a poor family always had plenty of. All right, let's get into the actual method now, the one she taught me, the one I still use today more often than any fancier bread I know how to make. The first thing my mother taught me was what she called the flour paste, though nowadays you might hear fancier bakers call something similar by a French name. She never used any French names for anything in her kitchen, I promise you that. Here's what it is. You take a small amount of your flour, about a 1/4 cup, and you mix it with about a cup of water in a small pot on the stove, over low heat, stirring the whole time until it thickens up into something like a thin, smooth paste, almost like a loose pudding. It only takes a few minutes. You're not cooking it hard, just warming it gently until it thickens and turns a little glossy. Now here is why she did this, and it's the part most people skip today because they don't know it exists. When you cook a small portion of your flour with water like that, you break down the starches in a way that makes them incredibly easy for yeast to feed on. It's like pre-chewing the food for a baby. That little bit of paste becomes a feast for your yeast, and because the yeast has such an easy time feeding on it, a tiny amount of yeast can do the same job that a much larger amount would normally need to do. This is the whole trick, right here, in this one small pot on the stove. My mother didn't know the science of it, not the way I've come to understand it over the years, but she knew it worked, because her own mother showed her, and her mother's bread never failed. I remember standing on that stool, watching her stir that little pot, and asking her once why she didn't just buy more yeast if we needed the bread to rise faster. She looked at me, and she didn't scold me for asking, not even a little. She just said, because a spoonful of flour and a little bit of time costs nothing at all, and yeast from the store costs money we don't have to spare. I've never forgotten that. It wasn't said with any bitterness. It was said the way you'd explain any ordinary fact of the world, and that's exactly what it was to her. Once that paste cools down to warm, not hot, you mix it right into the rest of your dough, along with your yeast, your remaining flour, your water, and your salt. You'll use a whole lot less yeast than a typical recipe calls for, sometimes as little as a 1/4 teaspoon for a full loaf, because that paste is doing so much of the heavy lifting for you. The second thing, and this one takes some getting used to if you're accustomed to the fast recipes you see online, is the overnight slow rise. Instead of setting your dough somewhere warm so it puffs up in an hour, you're going to do the opposite. You're going to set it somewhere cool. Not cold, just cool, like a pantry or an unheated corner of the kitchen, and you're going to let it rise slowly overnight for somewhere between 8 and 12 hours. Here's where most people go wrong when they try something like this for the first time, and I want to save you the trouble. They panic because the dough doesn't look like much has happened after an hour or two, and they either throw more yeast in or they give up and move it somewhere hot to rush it along. Don't do either. A slow, cool rise isn't a failure in progress. It's the whole method working exactly the way it's supposed to. The yeast is multiplying gently in the cool air, and what you lose in speed, you gain back tenfold in flavor. Slow risen bread has a depth to it, a faint tang, almost like a very mild sourdough, that fast bread simply never develops. My mother's bread had that flavor every single time, and I didn't understand why until I was well into my own years of baking and started reading up on the fermentation process for myself. I do want to be honest with you about something here, because I think honesty is worth more than a perfect sales pitch. This method is not the right choice if you need bread on the table in an hour for supper tonight. It just isn't built for that. If you're in a hurry, you'll want a faster recipe with more yeast, and there's no shame in that at all. This trick is for when you have the evening before to plan ahead, and I'd encourage you to think of it less as an emergency recipe and more as a habit, something you build into your week the way my mother built it into hers. It rewards patience. It does not reward last-minute panic. The third thing, and this is the part with that chipped yellow bowl I mentioned at the start, is that my mother never let a single scrap of dough go to waste. Every single time she made bread, before she shaped the final loaves, she would pinch off a small piece of that risen dough, about the size of a plum, and she would set it into that yellow bowl, cover it with a damp cloth, and leave it on the counter. The next time she made bread, that little piece of old dough went right back into the new batch, right alongside the fresh yeast and the flour paste. It was already alive, already full of all that yeast activity from the day before, and it gave the new dough a running head start. She called it her keeper, and she treated it the way some people treat a good cast iron pan, which is to say, she never once let it go to waste, and she never once threw it out to start fresh. Some weeks that keeper was years old by the time I was paying attention to it. Years, mind you, not months. A little piece of dough, carried forward, loaf after loaf after loaf, feeding each new batch and getting fed in turn. There's something almost family about that, if you think on it long enough. It outlived plenty of things in that kitchen. If you want to try this yourself, it's simple enough. After your dough has finished its first rise, before you shape it into a loaf, pull off a small piece, about the size of a golf ball, wrap it loosely in a floured cloth, and keep it in the refrigerator until your next baking day, which should be within about a week. When you're ready to bake again, let that little piece come up to room temperature, tear it into small pieces, and mix it into your fresh dough along with everything else. It adds a beautiful depth of flavor, and it means you're using just a touch less fresh yeast each time you bake, because that old piece is doing some of the work for you. The fourth thing my mother taught me was how to tell when the dough was ready, because in her day, nobody had a fancy thermometer or a timer with an alarm on it. She taught me to use my hands and my eyes instead, and honestly, I still trust this method more than any gadget I own. When the dough has risen enough, you press 2 fingers into it gently, about 1/2 inch deep, and then you take your fingers away. If the dough springs back quickly and fills the little dent right back in, it needs more time. If the dent stays there, slowly filling in just part way, holding most of its shape, that's when you know it's ready. If you press it and the whole thing just sort of collapses on you, sighing like an old cushion, you've let it go too long, and it's time to reshape it and give it a shorter second rise before baking. This poke test, as some folks call it nowadays, was second nature to my mother. She never once looked at a clock while she was deciding whether the dough was ready. She looked at the dough itself, and she touched it, and it told her everything she needed to know. I'd encourage you to trust your hands the same way. It takes a little practice, maybe 3 or 4 loaves before you really feel confident in it, but once you have it, you'll never lose it again. The fifth and last thing I want to share with you is about baking the loaf itself, because Depression-era ovens weren't anything like the precise digital ovens most of us have today. My mother's oven ran hot in one corner and cool in another, and she learned its quirks the way you'd learn a person's moods. She baked her bread at a temperature around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and she always turned the loaf around halfway through baking, about midway through a total bake time of somewhere between 35 and 45 minutes, so that the hotter side of the oven didn't scorch one end while the other end stayed pale. The bread was done when she could tap the bottom of the loaf with her knuckle and hear a hollow sound, like knocking on a door, rather than a dull, heavy thud. I do this exact same thing in my own kitchen today, even with a modern oven that's supposedly even all the way through. Old habits, I suppose, but also it simply works. If your oven has any hot spots at all, and most do, that halfway turn will save you from a lopsided loaf every single time. Now let me bring this all together for you, because I think the value in this trick becomes very clear once you see it laid out plainly. A single loaf of bread at a bakery counter today can run you $6, sometimes closer to $8 or $9 if it's one of those artisan loaves with a fancy name on the label. Say your family goes through 4 loaves a week, which isn't unusual at all for a household with children in it. At an average of $7 a loaf, that comes out to $28 a week, which adds up to somewhere around $1,456 over the course of a year, just on bread. Now compare that to my mother's method. A bag of flour, a small amount of yeast, stretched across many batches, thanks to that flour paste and that keeper dough, a bit of salt, and water from the tap. You can make 4 loaves a week for what amounts to just a few dollars total, some weeks less than $2 once you're reusing that keeper dough and buying yeast only occasionally. Even being generous and saying it costs you $3 a week in ingredients, that's only around $156 a year. That's a difference of well over $1,000 a year just from baking your own bread using a method that costs almost nothing beyond your own 2 hands and a little bit of overnight patience. But I'll tell you something, the money was never really the whole point of this story for me, even though it mattered plenty to my mother and her family at the time. The real payoff is what happens at the supper table. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, quite like watching your own children or your grandchildren tear into a warm piece of bread you made yourself, asking for a second slice before they've even finished the first. My own grandchildren still ask me to make the bowl bread, as they call it, whenever they come to visit, and every single time I think of my mother standing at that same stove, stirring that same little pot of flour paste, teaching me without ever once making it feel like a lesson. So here is your homework for this week, dear, and I want you to actually try it, not just watch and move along to something else. Make 1 loaf using the flour paste method I showed you with a reduced amount of yeast and let it rise slowly overnight in a cool spot rather than rushing it. Just 1 loaf. See what that overnight patience does to the flavor. I think it'll surprise you. And while you're at it, I'd love to know something from you. Tell me in the comments what your own family made when money was tight. Maybe it wasn't bread at all. Maybe it was a soup stretched with a little extra water, or a pie crust made without any lard to spare, or something your grandmother did in her kitchen that nobody else does anymore. I want to hear about it. I read every single one of these comments myself, everyone, and I love nothing more than hearing the small kitchen histories that families like yours have carried forward, the same way mine carried forward that chipped yellow bowl. Next time, I'm going to show you something my mother did with the heel end of a loaf that most people throw straight into the garbage without a second thought. And once you see what she turned it into, you may never waste a crust again. Until then, dear, keep your hands in the dough a little longer than feels necessary, keep a small piece of today's bread for tomorrow's batch, and always trust your own 2 hands over the clock on the wall.